Welcome to Come and See, your podcast for finding truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries. With host and founder, Richard Case, and co-host and retreat leader, Kathy Ricconi. Jesus reminds us to watch for the signs of his return. Today, we will explore further what we are seeing in our times that line up with what signs he said would indicate the potential of the end and his return. We will also discuss the practical meaning of this as we watch and as a remnant prepare as he so leads. And now your host, Richard Case.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is End Times Friday, and we have our good friend Denny, who's with us, co-hosting. And it's always exciting, Denny, to, I think partly because you're such an observer of the world events that we can, say, discuss these things and say, do they have any implication toward what we're trying to understand as believers? So it's really fun. I always enjoy this. We've been talking in the last several, we've been talking to our good friends, Eric and Rabbi from Israel, updating on the Iran war. And we thought maybe we'd give everybody just a brief update on that. We're going to spend time on other things these next two sessions. But what has happened is that, Trump put a deadline to basically what he called eliminate the civilization, which is kind of a broad, absurd statement in a way, but threatened it, which is going to be to blow up the energy sources and which would include oil refineries, but also power plants and then bridges, which the implication of that, Denny, and maybe you could briefly have a comment about that is, and even Eric, I had a in-between conversation with him about that. He thought that was a very foolish potential because then he moves it from a military operation to a civilian operation because it definitely would hamper the living conditions of every single person in Iran, who, by the way, most of them don't even support their own government, but they can't do much about it. And he thought that would shift the world completely against Israel and U.S. About it. He still has threatened it, and then what it did, it caused a discussion about, okay, let's do a permanent ceasefire. They did a 2-week ceasefire, which, by the way, is coming up next week at the end of it. April 21st, when we're airing this before. And then they had Vance over there with Kushner and Vidikov. Didn't get anywhere, supposedly. Trump said, okay, well, we'll just continue to do what we're going to do. And they came back. And by the way, they did a takeover of the Straits of Hormuz through what's called a blockade. And a blockade is that they don't let any ships pass. And they're out there to look at if there's any dangerous ships like mine layers and or attack boats, they would just eliminate those. But what they do is they identify, are you coming from or to an Iranian port? If you are, you have to turn around because we're not going to allow you. And interesting enough, they are. If you're coming from a different port, not Iranian, they'll let you through. Well, it had a big impact. I know you had a thought about that. Do you have any kind of view of the impact of that?
First of all, I don't think anyone saw it coming exactly that way. And this gets into this question of, is Trump really a lot more clever than people give him credit for? And he does the same pattern over and over, and the world still falls for it over and over. Everybody knows, all right, he makes an absurd statement, and he uses it as a basis to negotiate towards something in the middle. But I think what people miss is oftentimes he throws stink bombs out, and they're intended to make you think that he's anchored in one position. In reality, he's anchored in a completely opposite position or a different position, and he's working the solution in a different way than people expect. So we were all at a place where we were expecting a transition, as you said, from military targets to civilian targets. And remember, this is on top of a population that, as of yesterday, was reported to be experiencing 180% inflation in Iran. By the IMF or somebody like that it is dire. Supplies are very, very low. People, in the country, people are really suffering.
Yeah, by the way, just to give people a picture of that, and Eric's described it, he said, okay, if I'm going to go down to a coffee shop and buy a cup of coffee and a donut, I would have to take a suitcase of money to do it, which they don't have. I mean, so when you say dire, we don't have any fathom of what that really looks like, but it's it's dire. It's really dire.
Yeah, it's like buy a cup of coffee and a donut, hold on to it for a few hours, and resell it for twice what you paid for it.
Yeah.
So I think people didn't see this coming. He almost as though those three went to Pakistan knowing that there was going to be a standoff with the idea you got 24 hours to make a deal or not. And what was always in the back pocket was this idea we are prepared to blockade that entire area. Even though the thin part of that strait is relatively small, that entire area waterway is gigantic, and we've got ships positioned and have had ships positioned all over the place. To effectively turn on a blockade that fast, they had to have this well thought through, well orchestrated, well practiced, well rehearsed, and almost immediately it was effective, like you said. So, from a military standpoint, Trump's detractors hate this idea, but you have to conclude that these have been sort of very, very clever moves he's making, and he's actually put Iran in the position you really want him in, which is they have no choice now but to negotiate seriously, because people are going to start dying there, including the leadership. There just isn't going to be supply of anything.
Right. Yeah. And the impact which was a clever move, because remember, Eric kept saying, remember, Israel doesn't get any oil from through the Straits of Hormuz. They don't care per se. America actually gets very little oil from there. So they truly don't care. And Trump was trying to say to NATO and then all the China, other Middle Eastern countries who do get oil from Iran is it's your problem. You guys step up. Well, none of them did. So you would have thought he would have just said, okay, then I'll just quit. I'll just leave and you guys deal with it. But because he's trying to get to the disarmament of nuclear power, he actually took it over. Interesting enough, the two implications is what you said. One, and again, we're when you listen to this, you will have actually experienced what happened. But the first set of negotiations, was left with no solution. They're going to enter into another round of negotiation with Iran, with the conditions that they know are there, to see how they'll play out. Now, Eric's position would be Iran will agree to things, but they won't honor them. But at least they'll get past this point, So he said they'll have to keep observing it. And then two is that the NATO countries and China, interesting enough, now are meeting without the United States and without Israel to say, okay, what will we do to make sure that oil flows nicely through the straits, knowing that there will have to be some kind of an agreement with the United States because of the nuclear question. So it'll be interesting to watch what really happens. And I'd love then, after this occurs, which we'll get Eric and Rabbi in and say, okay, now that they've, quote, agreed, what do you see as reality? What do they have to do and how they process it? And one of the things, if we could just set up how they have done it, with Gaza and Hamas, with Lebanon and Hezbollah. They neutralized them, but it didn't eliminate them. So what they do is they restructure and to gain more strength to do what they're going to do anyway, come against Israel. So what Israel's doing fundamentally is observing. When they see that developing, they just go in and try to take it out earlier and not allow them to gain that strength. And they've been so successful at it. And they're actually, interesting enough, in a peace negotiation, a ceasefire negotiation with Lebanon and Hezbollah at the same time. So it's interesting to see. My thought will be Iran will probably agree to something. They'll have no intention of honoring that agreement. And Israel will be the one to observe and keep track of it. And as they see it happen, they'll then come back and do some military action, against them. Do you have any other perception or thought about that piece of it?
I think that because there's been a successful blockade created, that will not, even if there's an agreement, that blockade will not stop. That it'll probably be turned over to some international. That what will come of these conversations in Europe is a slow agreement with most of the rest of the world to manage this blockade through for quite a while, as we watch in what ways Iran does not comply with the elements of whatever deals made. So that's number one. I think it turns out it is the pinch point that is now the leverage that now the United States controls, that 3 days ago Iran seemed to control. So I think that's a big part of the play. I think the second thing that's going to happen is the terms of this deal will be a very, very short leash. There will be actions that Iran has to take in days and weeks. So if they don't follow through, it's going to be immediately evident, like the international community taking over all the highly enriched uranium in some way, or mining, clearing out the places that it exists in concretium and some solution to that highly enriched uranium. And that one, I think, has to be part of the deal because it's the thing that goes back to why the United States entered into this to start with. And Trump has managed to keep the nuclear weapon deal as the single justification for everything that has occurred. While other things may have changed, I think there's probably still long-range missiles that they'll probably try and deal with. But I think those are the two really important issues: that short leash and control of the strait and oil tankers and other supplies that are able or not able to get into and out of Iran. That'll be heavily monitored. I think it will shift to more of an international force, but the United States naval presence will still be the biggest part of it because of how large it is. So, and I think Israel is going to continue to work the leadership issues. I think they're going to keep taking out guys. If there's any failure to comply, more leaders will disappear, or more of sort of civilian related activity will come from Israel.
Yeah, and the economic impact for us Americans will be, if it's resolved to some level, what will happen is oil prices will drop back to normal, semi-normal.
They're slowly coming down now.
That means our gas prices at the pump will come down, and that'll free up, what we call discretionary income that's pushing everybody right now, particularly the middle and the lower class is really struggling with this. It'll also soften inflation because so many things are driven by that it'll just have a softening effect, should have a decent little positive impact on our economy. And the feeling of the Americans, if we, let's say, cease having to do things there, and therefore we can bring people back, our military back, without engaging on a ground war. See, we'll all rejoice that, hey, you did that with technology. You had very few people that were killed, and they were mostly accidental. And you did what you said you were going to do, and Iran capitulated and needed to, and it'll be hailed as a big win. And we'll have a sigh of relief that we're not going to have a prolonged war. We don't have to engage our people, and our economy is going to be impacted in a big way. So that'll be interesting to watch, to see where that goes with this. One thing behind the scene, by the way, which is what I know through some inside information, is that the United States, in a sense, couldn't keep prosecuting this war because they don't have the inventory. Yeah. Bluffing as if he does, but underneath it all, they don't. So they couldn't do it anyway. And this is interesting on strategy, you would think this would be the moment that if China's going to do something, they should do it now because we're so at a weak point. But they can't do it either, and not going to do it either. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. We'll
Rich,
keep you updated.
On that, I know from a family member that is involved with one of those kinds of military suppliers. They are all moving into a period of mandatory overtime because they have been told how much they have to step up their output. And many of these are not companies that are used to that. They're used to cost plus contracts with the government and take your time and very low production outputs, and they are getting a huge squeeze, and they're yielding to it. So I think behind the scenes, you think about that, and then this budget reconciliation that is a bill that's coming up in Congress, mostly to deal with the defunding of Homeland Security and other things, but it's going to turn into a massive reconciliation bill that's probably going to pour a lot of new money into the military effort too. And the timing of that just happens to suddenly finally be working out after recess, and the Senate is coming back intending to pass a budget reconciliation bill, which only requires 50% in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah. Now, describe for our audience, when you say a budget reconciliation bill, describe what exactly is that?
Yeah. So for purely financial related matters, this is not lawmaking that has policy impact, and it gets tested against that. The rules of a 60% majority in the Senate don't apply. This changed a few years ago I don't even remember under which administration, but that was budget reconciliation is a 50-50. And so you can pass if more than half of the Congress, which is still, until the next election, is still controlled by Republicans. If the Republicans stay together enough on this to just be able to get 50%, they can pass a funding bill. Essentially, it's a funding bill that readjusts the budget that doesn't really exist. But it readjusts all those baselines, and suddenly the efforts that are being considered are now funded. And here's
a question about that: is that because of the Homeland Security, including ICE, has not been, and TSA was an impact of that as well. wasn't funded for now going on almost 2 months. Why didn't they pursue that earlier to just take care of that? Because that's really what they're trying to do, is just bypass the block and just say, hey, you know what? We can do it a different way. Why didn't they do it earlier?
There was debate about that, and part of the reason it was difficult for Republicans to get a majority is because there were, especially in the Senate, there were Republicans that believed that was the way it should have been approached all along. And there were other disputes among Republicans about the way to work their way through the agenda for this year. That's one thing. The second thing is most of these bills started in the House. And so you bump into the Senate rules and the 60%, when you're already into a process.
Okay.
This is the first time Johnson has come out and now said, not Johnson, Thune has come out and said there is a reconciliation bill that will come to the Senate, that will begin in the Senate, be completed by the Senate, and it'll go over to the House. So it's a very different sort of approach. And look back and say, why didn't we do this all along? All that fighting and all that anguish over the TSA lines and, the budget and Homeland, that this part of Homeland Security was already funded for 3 years because of the budget components of the big, beautiful bill. The whole thing seemed like an unnecessary step. But, maybe there's some real thinking behind that too. And when it all gets said and done, you kind of look back and say, oh, I see. But, for most of us, it doesn't make sense. It looks like a horrible waste of time and disruptions of lots of lives. The security of the country was potentially, at risk for parts of this.
I think one reason, by the way, is that it was a political move purposely to cause the trouble that the average person would experience and be upset about it, one. And then who are they going to be upset with? Well, because the Democrats are the ones blocking it consistently without, doing it. And they never actually talk about what the Republicans need to do to overcome that block. But they think, Republicans think this will help when they go to elect in the midterm. People will remember that the Democrats, stopped this stuff. So I think it was a little bit motivated by politics.
I think the politics are just enormous between now and midterm. Right now, the Republicans are really in trouble on a number. There's people this morning saying they could lose 20 seats in the House and potentially even lose control of the Senate. But I think everything in this midterm is driven by this central focus. If Trump is able to stop a 47-year, really serious worldwide problem with this regime in Iran, if he's really able to put it in a box and control it, and in ways that are good for almost everyone else in the world, it's going to overwhelm this midterm view. I mean, people that hate Trump really hate Trump, and it's so deep. But I think the facts will start to, he's not running in this midterm. And he's not running for election after this. And he doesn't seem to be all that moved by the questions of whether or not his party's going to lose in the midterms. He will step back and probably say, all I cared about was what was good for the world. And that's where I think that the big question about the outcome of the election will be. There will be people that will say, we don't believe that because you're such a flawed character. There will be other people that will say, a certain amount of this has been highly orchestrated, and he was actually willing to be orchestrated into Mr. Meany in order to get the right outcome. And hopefully policy success will win at the midterm over all this other stuff.
Yeah. And two things about that is that what is the driver that what's happening, with the Republican, let's say, majority, so to speak, that there would be a significant shift away from that, which would say, let's elect Democrats. One, what's driving that? And then two, as you look at the potential outcome, let's assume that happens. What would be the implication? Because our conversation is about other signals that help us see where it's going, and what the impact is going to be economically and then the end time. So the first question is, what do you see as driving that thought that, even with all the frustration going on with the funding, why would they elect Democrats when they didn't do it 2 years ago?
Well, I think the demonization of this administration is so pervasive, and in a way we've seen it for several election cycles, several administrations. The emotion between one side or the other just gets deeper and deeper and worse, and that feels like something that has a spiritual side of it, regardless of the success or failure of an administration or the Congress. The hatred from one side to the other is overwhelming the success, successes and failures. And I think that's true with Trump. So for sure, for people who are staunchly non-conservative, they are motivated to show up and vote against him. They don't know what so if they believe they'll be voting against Trump when they vote for their local, their representatives and their Senate candidates and others, statewide in each of their states. They'll believe that they are casting a vote against Trump. The Republicans have the problem they've always had, which is on principle and on policy, they don't agree on everything with each other. And the party doesn't force them to agree on things. So you end up with split votes on really important issues for policy reasons. They're not at all about who you like or you hate. And I think this has gotten worse. Some of the other topics we were going to talk about in this session and the next one is other things that are going on that are accelerating this hatred, this demonization. And I think they're going to play a role in the next election.
Yeah. So what we're going to talk about in our next session is that very issue. As there is interesting, kind of spiritual stuff that is happening, particularly in the religious world, and then the impact of that on the economy and the potential creation of the one world government that we'll talk about. And just to set it up, because we're going to talk about interesting dynamic going on with the Catholic Church, and then Trump, which I saw it and I was shocked by it in a way, but he came out with a meme. And it characterized him as Jesus Christ. And it was immediately, everybody was like, wait a second. Interesting enough, Riley Gaines, who's been, helping on women sports and transgender, who's very pro-Trump, she came out publicly and said, that's something that is demonstrating, what she called pride, and he needs some humility. And then she's been attacked by the followers of Trump who almost overlook anything that he is, in a sense, the savior. And so it's a dynamic that is happening right now. And this is what Denny and I are going to try to talk about next session is while we see Iran war, while we see economic stuff, there's some interesting spiritual stuff going on behind it that the question is what's happening? How do we interpret it? And then are these signals that God is trying to show us about, what's coming ahead. So, Denny, thank you so much for all this great insight. And we'll look forward to this next session as we continue this. So, Heavenly Father, we just praise you for what you're revealing, what you're showing, and helping us raise the right questions, because you say you'll speak to that. You'll give insight. You'll give wisdom. And that's what we're seeking. What does it mean? How do we receive it? And what would you say to us as to what to watch next and how to react to it? So we praise you and we thank you now in Christ's name. If any of you have any questions that you'd like to send and we can deal with, send it in at questions@abideministry.com, and we'd love to talk to you. So look forward to it. Tune in next week and we'll get into this other interesting stuff.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Come and See, your podcast for truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries. Send us your questions and comments and tune in tomorrow for more answers to your personal questions about living life in God's truth. Remember, God's will is best and none better. His truth brings peace in this world of chaos.